Welcome back. Hello, good morning, Richard. It's good to see you
Good
today.
morning. How are things over there?
Doing all right. Way over here on this side of the office while you're on
Right,
that side of the office.
Okay. No, they're good. They're good. Middle of summer, nice and warm, humid, hot.
Nice and warm. While it's 90,000 degrees outside. But
And 90,000% humidity.
yes, it's awful. But that is not the topic of our podcast today. Though it's probably related because we're going to talk about a topic that we've talked about many times before, and that is related to the internet and gaming and electric devices as it relates to teenagers. And I guess the way it's related is that teenagers aren't going outside all that much. So what are they doing? They're inside playing video games and they're on social media and things like that. And so we're going to talk about that today with a slightly different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. These articles keep coming around. They keep cycling, and everybody's aware of that. These articles seem to have a life of their own. They just keep circling through the news cycles. But recently we've been inundated with stuff about the internet, how the internet, in fact, all forms of digital media are particularly damaging to teenagers. That's a recurring theme. That there's something about teenagers that makes these things particularly difficult and problematic. And in fact, we talked a few weeks ago about a book called The Anxious Generation by John Haidt, who said he said that he argues that it's the great rewiring of childhood that is the cause of the sharp increase in anxiety and depression among children, especially teenagers. We talked about that a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
But we want to make 2 points today. One is that it's not just the great rewiring. We said that in our earlier podcast about Haidt's book, is that there's more than just digital media at play here. There are other forces at work. And the second thing that we want to talk about today is that teenagers are at risk. I mean, you and I are neuropsychologists. We understand brain development. Yes, teenagers are at increased risk, but so are others.
Right.
All children are at increased risk for the same reason, and that is that the brain continues to develop across the lifespan. Okay?
Well, and I think that not just children,
Right.
but adults as well. And
Mhm.
I think that there's something to be said about that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But yes, it's the great rewiring. He talked about in his book, and again, one of our big challenges with Haidt's book is the cause, the word cause. And it talks
Right.
about how technology and social media and things are causing these issues. And we don't think that it's causing anything. There's lots of factors involved and lots of other issues that have to be addressed and examined. But the problem as we see it, and we've talked about this again in past podcasts, is that we're really talking about what's being replaced. We're talking about technology and social media and video games and things like that are replacing other things that are important and critical for healthy development. And
Right.
it's not so much that it's our perspective, I think, is that it's not so much that it's specifically video games and specifically social media and specifically technology. It's
Mhm.
the fact that these other important developmental milestones and developmental experiences are being replaced with something else.
Mhm. That's right.
That's a massive issue.
Right. When we first started getting these articles about the internet and teenagers, we're reading them and talking about them, and almost simultaneously we said, well, it's not just teenagers who are affected by this. I mean, everybody at every level, at every stage of development is affected by this.
Right.
When children spend most of their time on screen, it's not just what they're looking at. Parents say, well, they're they're on the wrong websites. They're in places we don't want them to go. Absolutely, we understand that. I'm not sure that's part of the problem, but the other problem is when you're on screen, you're denying the opportunity to develop other critical, whether they're physical development, social development, academic development. It's the denial of opportunity that becomes the issue
Right.
at every level of development. And so we want to talk a little bit before we get into the studies that have been conducted on this topic. And there are two nice papers that we're gonna talk about later. We want to explain a little bit of the background of why we feel the way we do about this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the brain, how the brain develops. Um, because to be sure, we know there's a negative effect. We've been told about the negative effect on teenagers' brains, but there are changes. These changes are not confined just to teenagers. Um, and if you understand how the brain develops, it develops from conception.
Right.
So you all know the story about at conception, there are two cells. But during the course of a pregnancy, these cells, just in the nervous system, we're not talking about skeleton and muscles and everything else, just in the nervous system, they increase from these two little cells, to 100 billion neurons during the pregnancy.
Right.
And in order for that to happen, to produce that many cells in 40 weeks, the brain produces about 250,000 cells per minute. So you
Yeah.
have this massive growth spurt that
Right.
occurs during pregnancy. But that's only half the story.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other half is all these neurons, there's about 1,000 different types. They cluster into functional units. If you think of a map of the United States, you have all these 50 functional units, but all those units have to connect to each other.
Right.
And it's the connection that's the important part of what we want to talk about today. It's all those connections.
Yeah. And what we hope is that as the brain develops, and I remember when I was studying this in grad school, you around that same time we were having I was having children, and you
Mhm.
sit there and it starts to make you paranoid a little bit, thinking, all of this stuff has to go just right.
Right.
Because if it doesn't go just right, then there's lots of problems. And when you start to think about the probability of
Right.
something messing up or something not going quite right, you start to realize that, man, we are very lucky to have how lucky you are to have a healthy baby.
That's
Um,
right.
because all of these things have to form in just the right way, at just the right time. And they have to branch out, and those branches have to go in the right direction at just the right time. And all of that happens, so much of that happens in utero prior to birth.
Right.
It does continue to happen
Mhm.
after, but we hope that all of these things progress and that they work seamlessly, that they work in such a way that they is sort of that orchestra of music that our brain plays as all of those different neurons that you were just mentioning, all those work together to help us to be able to move and to be able to breathe and for our heart to beat, and all that stuff has to happen. And if any of those neurons aren't doing what they're supposed to do, or are not where they're supposed to be, that stuff doesn't work right.
Right. Yeah. And if you think about, you think about the heart, it's a single muscle that beats.
Yeah.
The whole thing works together. The liver, the kidney. These are unitary structures. The brain is like a mosaic. It's like a puzzle. Okay. It's like a moving puzzle. And everything, all these regions have to work together so that um, if some of those neurons hear, some of the neurons see, some of them are about movement.
Yeah.
And all these different types of neurons have to work together. To work together, they have to constantly be communicating with each other. So if I hear a question, I part of my brain understands that question, and then I have to get that understanding to another part of the brain that does the speaking. Okay. So these two regions have to be able to communicate with each other. I have to get information from hearing to speech.
Right. And
This is an incredibly complex process of passing information, and this is going on all day, all throughout the brain.
right. And it's what's just so fascinating. You mentioned us, we're neuropsychologists, and so the more that you get into it, the more fascinating that it is. Because
Right.
like you just said, you hear a question and you process that information and then you respond with speech. Well, you know, the step there are 100 or more steps just between the sound waves hitting your ear and you
Hmm.
processing that it was a question. There's a thousand different things that happen neurologically
Right.
before just between those two events. In
Hmm.
that, 300 milliseconds. Um,
Right. That's right.
there are a thousand things that happen, and if any of those things don't happen, then you misunderstand the question, you
Right.
mishear the question, you respond inappropriately to the question. Um, and like as you said, it all has to work seamlessly. And all of these connections that we're talking about, they don't happen by happenstance. They don't happen automatically. There's two things. There is we've all heard of these, nature and nurture.
Hmm.
There is this biological DNA based process that happens as we're developing. And as we're just saying, we hope that all of that develops the way that it's supposed to develop and that they go where they're supposed to go. But there's another part. There is the entire aspect of nurture. There is the entire experience that we have in life that influences how our neurons develop and how those connections are made. And if those things aren't nurtured, if we don't use them, then they are pruned and they are cut back and we lose them.
That's right. So even from conception, um, this happens automatically. It happens biologically. It's coded into our DNA, but you can interfere with that process. X-rays, alcohol, drugs, they will interfere with that process if you don't have good nutrition. So anything you do can interfere with the biological part. But after birth, the important thing is life experiences. You have to do things,
Mhm.
and that will make these connections grow and connect. And we see this play out in infants all the time. An infant is born with the ability to hear and see. But if you, for some reason, would plug their ears or cover their eyes, those neurons will die off because they're not being used. If you don't stimulate the visual system from birth on, if you don't stimulate the visual system, the neurons that do the seeing will die off. And in fact, it's called pruning. And you think of pruning a plant. And that process of dying off occurs throughout our lifetime.
Yeah,
And that's why it's the idea of use it or lose it. Is at work in the brain every single day, in every single person from birth to death.
right.
If you don't use those neurons, they are going to die and the connections are going to die off. The reason that happens, the reason they degrade is because if 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 neurons aren't doing anything, they're going to die off to make space for neurons that do things. There's a reason why the brain is wrinkled, and it's wrinkled because you have to get a lot of matter into a small space. So
Right.
the brain has a lot of matter and it has to fit in this little skull. In order to do that, you have to scrunch it up. There isn't room for lying around. If
Right.
if neurons are not working, you're going to get rid of them. It knows to get rid of them, and you're going to lose those functions. Okay.
Absolutely.
So remember that throughout life, whether you're talking about a neonate, an infant, a toddler, you have to stimulate that person has to be stimulated throughout life in order for those connections to be made. You
Absolutely.
have to have that stimulation, and it has to be in every area of life, whether it's social, physical, academic, intellectual, language. You have to be stimulating the brain in order for the brain to build the connections it needs to be competent.
Absolutely. And that sort of brings us back to, the topic of digital media,
Right.
in teenagers, but also just to all of us. And,
Mhm.
the idea that, and Richard, we've both worked with people who, not just teenagers, but middle-aged adults who,
Right.
for whatever reason in their life, they became so connected to social media or their digital devices that you could start to see their social relationships, their, some of their communication skills, some of those things. You can see some of those skills starting to deteriorate. That suddenly this person who, in their 50s, suddenly they are very awkward when they're talking to people, so, face to face. They text all the time, but all of their social relationships are starting to be damaged because they're spending so much time on their devices. And again, our perspective is it doesn't even necessarily have to be devices, electronic devices. It could
Right.
be anything. If you spend 15 hours a day reading a book, that's just as much of a problem as spending 15 hours a day on your digital device. It's still taking you away from these other things that you should be doing.
That's
Um,
right.
so
You
but it
see,
doesn't matter the age, it could happen at any time.
right. You see, it's not just children. We talk about increased weight or lack of muscle mass in children. That exists across the lifespan.
Yeah.
And you have to be doing all these things. And you're right. It doesn't matter what you're doing to excess. One person wrote, we sleep for 8 hours, we work or go to school for 8 hours, and that leaves 8 more hours to do everything else. Well, if you're filling up that third column with one activity, you're going to get good at one activity.
No matter what that activity is.
Yeah, the Olympics are coming. Oh, in a couple of weeks, we have the Paris Olympics. Those gymnasts or runners or whatever they're good at what they do because that's what they've spent most of their time doing, and they got very good at that. But they're not very good at a lot of other things because they've ignored those, and those neural pathways are going to get silent. Okay. And so that's a real good example that you said one time, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. And the more you do something, the better you're going to be at it. But you have to do everything. Humans are structured that we have all areas of development that have to be nurtured and stimulated at every age level.
Yeah.
And if you're spending most of your time on the internet, if you spend most of your time playing video games, your brain is going to get very good at playing video games.
Right.
It's not going to be very good at reading. It's not going to be very good at algebra. It's not going to be very good with social interaction with real people in real time because you're not developing those neural connections.
Absolutely. So we're gonna talk a little bit for the last bit of the podcast today. We're going to talk about two articles that were recently
Mhm.
published. First was on internet intoxication
Right.
and the effect of overexposure on to the teenage brain, and this one came out at the end of June, June 30th. And then just a few days later, this other article came out on internet addiction and what it does to teenage brains. And um, again, we're going to talk about that, but again, we want to emphasize that it's not just the teenage brain that's affected by this. This is something that can affect anyone at any age. It
Mhm.
just so happens that these studies were specifically focused on teenagers. And the,
Right.
the first article on internet intoxication was from a study that was conducted at UCLA,
Mhm.
and it had 237 participants, which is
It's pretty
a
good.
decent number of
Mhm.
people, and
Right.
they're between the ages of 10 and 19. And if you guys who are listening remember, a few weeks ago we said one of the problems with this research is that it's really just looking at like college age
Mhm.
people,
Mhm.
like older teenagers and early adults. So this is a study for 10 to 19, that where they enrolled 10 to 19-year-olds, and then they followed them for 10 years.
This is
So
a pretty impressive study. I mean, when I read that, I thought, wow, somebody did a lot of work here.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's tough to get people to enroll participants at that age because you have to reach out to the parents, and you have to get the parents to come in and then follow them over 10 years. That's not an easy thing to do. Um,
Right.
But what the overall findings were that those who had sort of that compulsive clicking and scrolling and that compulsive use of digital devices produce less activity in certain areas of the brain that are important for, like, critical thinking and decision making and some of those, important cognitive functions, that there was less activity in those regions of the brain than in those who, maybe weren't as active digitally or electronically. Um, and again, we're not saying that you can't say that it was causal, but there is a relationship that the more that you use, the more that you're using the technology, the less the less neural activity there was in these critical brain regions.
Right. And we all know, and everybody has heard that the brain doesn't finish developing until you're in your mid-20s and the frontal lobe develops last. Well, what's happening in the brain during these same ages, from 10 to 19, is the development of connections from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. Okay. And that's where these critical thinking and decision making is done in the frontal lobe of the brain.
Mhm.
So so it stands to reason that if a teenager is spending most of their time just mindlessly scrolling through the internet, looking for funny videos, they're on YouTube, you're on TikTok, you're on whatever you're on. If you're just scrolling and reading and chatting and doing all those things, those connections that build the connections to the frontal lobe are going to be compromised because you're not stimulating them enough. You're spending your time doing one activity and you're ignoring the activities that would build those connections. You're not spending time in decision making and critical thinking, because that typically happens in school, and you're ignoring school stuff to be on the internet. And so the brain responds as the brain responds. If you're not doing that school stuff, if you're not doing critical thinking, you're not going to develop critical thinking pathways. And
Right.
that's what that's what this study showed.
Right.
There's another study, the second study.
Yeah.
I'll let you take that one.
Oh, the
Um,
second study, yeah, it looked at internet addiction, and we've talked about it before. Like, not a big fan of the use of addiction when it
right,
comes to some of these things, but it is the term that's used in research, and so when um, this is a study done by Kimberly Young at University of Pittsburgh, and what she was looking at was studies. So she did a study of studies. She
right.
found
Mhm.
12 studies and did a meta-analysis to look at the relationship of internet addiction and brain functioning, and they looked at functional MRIs and of those teenagers who were formally diagnosed with internet addiction. And again, internet addiction isn't technically a diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but again, it's used in different ways to
Doesn't
right.
the World Health Organization recognize internet addiction?
I believe so. Yeah, in the
And
international.
we don't in our country have a specific diagnosis for internet addiction.
Right.
But I think the World Health Organization recommended it. We just haven't adopted it yet.
Yeah.
But these researchers use gambling addiction as sort
Right.
of as the model. Then there are 8 characteristics. So they have adopted and used gambling addiction as the criteria. And there are 8 criteria for gambling addiction.
Mhm.
So to qualify for internet addiction, you need 5 of the 8 criteria. You have to meet 5 of the 8 criteria.
Right.
Um, here's what surprised me.
Right.
Internet addiction is the average amount of internet usage was 38.5 hours per week versus 4.9. I mean, there's
Right.
a vast difference.
So right. So what that means is those who were categorized because they had 5 out of 8 of those criteria, who were those teenagers who were classified as having an internet addiction, their average amount of internet use was 38 and a half hours a week.
Right, right,
Those who did not meet that criteria, so they had less than 5 of the 8 inclusion criteria, those who did not meet criteria for internet addiction Their average was 4.9 hours a week. That is
I was
a massive difference.
I was really stunned by that. When I saw that, wow, there's that big a difference. So what we're talking about is an enormous amount of practice time being devoted to one activity.
Well, and as you said a minute ago, you have this time of our lives that are divided into three. You sleep for 8 hours, you work for 8 hours, and you have 8 other hours. You know, they spend a work week, 38 and a half hours. That's about 40 hours
Forty,
on the
yeah,
internet.
that's true. That's true. It's a 40-hour work week. Mhm.
So all the time you spend at work is how much time they spend just scrolling the internet.
Right.
And
And
so
again,
there's no way that it cannot have an effect. Again, no matter what you're doing, if you're doing it for 40 hours a week, it's going to have an effect on your development.
imagine doing any single activity. Imagine you went out and played tennis 40 hours a week, golfed, kicked a soccer ball.
Yeah,
If you spent 40 hours a week doing it, you're going to get very good at it. But what's the other message here? What are you not doing
right,
so that you can do that? It's the denial of opportunity that is concerning here.
right,
And I like that they used functional MRI because they actually took pictures of the brain while the brain is active.
right.
Okay, that's what fMRI would give us. And the findings, if you take all the findings from all 12 studies, internet addiction is correlated with physical alterations in the brain
Right.
at these connections where these different areas of the brain need to connect to each other, and they found alterations in the connectivity.
Absolutely. And again, it's not, this isn't something that would just happen to teenagers. This is something that would happen across the lifespan
Right.
because as you said a minute ago, you know, those connections continue, they form perhaps during this portion of our life, during this stage of our life.
Mhm.
But throughout our life, if you don't use those connections are pruned. Those
Right.
connections are cut back so that other connections can be strengthened.
Right.
And so it doesn't matter how old you are, if you're spending, a work week doing anything that, one single activity for 40 hours a week, it's going to change the way that your brain is functioning simply because it's taking you away from doing other things that your brain is wired to do.
That's right. Right. And that's what we meant when we said it's not just teenagers. Teenagers happen to be a little more susceptible because of some other things, but it happens at every age. We used to talk about people retire from work and they start to watch TV and you see this decline. Okay. Well, part of that decline is they're not using all those brain structures. And so they're going to start dying off. That's what we call decline. Okay. So once again, as with the other study, where we saw the changes here in these 12 studies is what gets disrupted. Cognitive control, reward valuation, motor coordination, all the things that you're not doing, all those functions begin to degrade.
Mhm.
Um, so the other thing that's interesting besides these cognitive differences is these studies also showed that students with internet addiction acted and reacted with the same anger as gambling addiction. And so when you take it away, when you say to your children, we're going to limit this, we're going to take it away, you're going to get that very angry addict response
Mhm.
to that suggestion. They do not want to give it up.
Right. And here we are. I'm just beating the dead horse with this, but if I believe, and I don't, to my knowledge, there are no studies that look at this, but if you had a person who, I'm going to use the example of reading a book. If you took somebody who read a book for 40 hours a week
Mhm.
and suddenly said, you're not allowed to have any more books, you're not allowed to read any,
Mhm.
they're going to respond with the same kind of anger.
Right, right.
What our brain wants to do is what our brain is used to doing. It wants to, whether it's playing video games or it's reading or it's playing tennis or it's doing math, whatever it is,
Mhm.
Whatever your brain is used to doing, whatever you're doing repeatedly, your brain is going to be driven to do. And
Right.
so whenever you take that away, you're going to respond uh, in the way that a quote unquote addict would respond. You're going to be opposed to that. You're going to be frustrated and angry perhaps about that. And so, it's going to affect lots of areas of functioning because your body is going to want to do that thing. Your
Mhm.
body is going to
Right.
be driven to do that thing.
Right.
So it makes sense that this is happening.
Right.
Teenagers are a little bit more susceptible, perhaps, because there's lots of big things happening. There's lots of things happening in their brain at that time. So,
Mhm.
or things can go wrong.
Right.
But it could happen at any time.
That's right. Yeah, and it's a good point that teenagers' brains are much more active. Just that's what happens in adolescence with puberty. You have these massive brain changes, and a more active brain, a lot of stuff can go wrong. That's why mental illnesses generally appear during adolescence. The second thing is teenagers tend to spend more time
Right.
on the internet, uh, up to 6 or 8 or 9 hours a day, versus 2 to 4 hours a day for kids for non-teenagers, for younger or older adults. They spend less time on the internet. So there are two risk factors.
Yeah.
Before leaving this, if you want to have fun, not fun, if you want an entertaining look at this issue, we've posted another article in the show notes, called "We're Wasting Our Lives Staring at Our Phones." It's a real nice,
Mhm.
refreshing look at this issue from the perspective of a guy who's thought about it pretty seriously.
Yeah.
We're not going to discuss this in the podcast, but I think it's worth reading. Take a look at it. It's a fun read,
Mhm.
but it's also informative. So take a look at that.
Absolutely.
uh,
Absolutely.
when
So
you
we,
when you're
we
finished.
will be, we will certainly visit and revisit and revisit and revisit this topic, because there's always something new coming out. It's a very important topic that lots of people are researching. And so we'll try to keep everyone up to date with what
Right.
is latest information. So
Mhm.
with that, that is it for today. Until
Okay.
next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.